Today at the National Press Club, a forum on adoption. Fewer than 400 children are adopted in Australia each year, when UNICEF estimates there are 13 million orphans around the world. Deborra-Lee Furness introduces the panel of Louise Voigt, Jane Aronson and Karyn Purvis for a discussion on policies for vulnerable children at the National Press Club.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club for today's National Australia Bank Address. A special event today, as you've just heard. I'm joined not by one speaker but four speakers here on the podium to mark National Adoption Awareness Week. It's estimated, as you just heard, that well in excess of 10 million children are orphans around the world, and yet while there are tens of thousands of Australian families who would dearly love to help out, to adopt a child, the number of children adopted each year runs into just a few hundred, in fact. It's a pressing issue and it's a frustrating issue, obviously, for those many families who would like to help out, who would like to adopt. The answers might seem easy, but the solutions apparently aren't. That's what we're going to discuss today. So joining us on the panel for today's forum, got the patron of Adoption Awareness Week and the Australian Director of the Worldwide Foundation, Orphans Foundation, I should say, and an ambassador as well for World Vision, the actress Deborra-Lee Furness. To her right, Dr. Karyn Purvis, a distinguished child psychologist, author of one of the best-selling books on adoption and director of the Institute of Child Development at the Texas Christian University. The founder and chief executive of the Worldwide Orphans Foundation and eminent professor of paediatrics, Dr. Jane Aronson. And finally, but certainly not least, Louise Voigt, the chief executive here in Australia of Barnardos. So let's get underway. Each of our speakers will make a reasonably short statement. Then will be some opening comments, obviously. Then we'll move to questions. We're going to start with Deborra-Lee.
Thanks, Larry. Okay, over the last 5 years, National Adoption Awareness Week has worked to change attitudes and expand the community's understanding and appreciation of adoption. Our mission is to bring adoption out of the shadows and help thousands of vulnerable Australian children and millions of kids from all over the world know what it is to find a family. I'm back at the Press Club, so obviously there's still work to be done. This time I brought some big guns with me, as you can see here, to fill in the gaps and accelerate the pace. If we stop talking about these kids who literally don't have a mum and dad to advocate for them, then any chance they have at realising any of their potential is lost. Any chance that they might have had a belonging in a family would be just a dream. And that's why I keep talking in the hope that this dialogue will germinate into some great ideas and turn into some great actions. To serve these kids, we need a champion within our government to take leadership and drive the issue forward. We need to streamline the procedures surrounding adoption so as it works efficiently and ethically and expediently. Our goal is to double the number of kids who are adopted in Australia in half the time it takes during this term of government. Today, we're calling on politicians of all persuasions and across all levels of government to recognise this critical and urgent situation and comment on this goal. And we're calling on the government to join forces and put vulnerable children first. After all, you don't need to be an adoptive parent to understand the plight of these kids. I just want to throw some statistics at you. Despite there's 18,000 children in foster care in Australia, all looking for a permanent home, only 70 were adopted last year. This is our local story, while globally, and there's no reliable data available on how many kids live in institutions on the streets or in refugee camps, but available evidence demonstrates there are literally millions of kids in this situation needing immediate help. Australia has one of the lowest adoption rates in the world, and the numbers are dropping despite the fact that there's an increase in the number of kids needing permanent home. Now, the inescapable reality is that the system's flawed. The hoops which prospective adoptive parents in Australia have to jump through vary wildly from state to state, like the railway gauges from yesteryear with their illogically different gauges. We've created a system in Australia which makes it a Herculean undertaking to adopt a child. You've got the rules, you've got the regulations, the red tape. None of it's uniform, none of it complementary, and much of it is unnecessarily complex. And the kids are the ones that are paying the price. So, over the next 12 months, adoption awareness will be leading the charge to find solutions. We have the resources to make this happen, and we've got the commitment to drive real change. And we're looking forward to working closely with the community, the private sector and policymakers to find the real solutions required to double the number of adoptions in half the amount of time. I'm just going to have a drink here. Okay, I got more to say. We've been working closely with Barnardos, Australia's one of the country's leading child protection charities, and Louise Voigt, who's going to speak about the local situation. I know that a child in foster care is cycled through 6 homes on average, and scientific studies show that children's brains don't develop properly without consistent parental care and connection, and this toxic stress leads to profound permanent damage. This is Dr. Karyn Purvis's piece. She's one of the leading experts in the world in this area, and she's going to address this vital piece, which is a post-adoption support. A positive development in this space is that this year, a recent announcement by the Families Minister, Prue Goward, of her intention to boost the number of adoptions in her state by hundreds. Now, these new rules, due to be debated in New South Wales Parliament this month, would cut red tape and give courts more power to consider adoption as a permanent solution for kids who've been removed from their birth families due to abuse and neglect. So this is definitely a great step forward. The number of orphan kids in the world outnumbers the entire population of Australia and then some, and these kids are pretty much invisible to the world. Dr. Jane Aronson knows many of these kids personally, and she's just come from Vietnam, where she was visiting with children who are now teenagers that her organisation, Worldwide Orphans, has been supporting since they were babies. These kids are the ones that weren't fortunate enough to find a family. So she's going to address the global situation of orphaned and vulnerable children. Now, as much as today is a call on the government to take action, it is also an opportunity to announce what we as an advocacy group are doing to bring about change. So much of what we hope to achieve in the next 12 months is about raising public awareness about adoption as an issue and to bring it out of the shadows into the light where it belongs. Next year, Adoption Awareness will be facilitating a global campaign designed to make the invisible visible to us all. And we intend to take our campaign to the United Nations with the support of some of the world's most influential people. And we want to petition the UN to recognise this issue and officially do something about it. Now, there's going to be endless opportunities for everyone to become a part of this community that will contribute to the betterment of a child's life. This is about the kids, and I hope that everyone will join us. Thank you so much.
And now the founder and chief executive of the Worldwide Orphans Foundation, Dr. Jane Aronson.
I'm very honoured to be here. I kind of feel, in a way, a little bit of an outsider, not knowing that much about how Australia works. But I am very aware of the amount of energy and goodwill around the issue of orphans and adoption in Australia. And I'm often very touched when I come to visit here. I've been invited by Deborah. I guess this is our, third time doing this? And I sometimes wonder, so what is my purpose? I've got a little baby up on the monitor here for you. I want you to look at him. He's a sweet one. His name is Win. And I want you to do something just a little bit unusual for the National Press Club. I want you to let me enter your thoughts right now. I want to see if we can do a little channeling. Let me in and let me have your trust, and let's surrender our feelings at this moment, but let's not think too much. I know he's cute, but let's talk a little bit more about why he's so cute. I want you all to close your eyes. Can you do that for me? It's light out, and it's not usually what we do, but let's close our eyes. Let's take a short journey into the world of loss and fear and anxiety, a chaotic world that should never be the world a child enters. Give up reason and join me in my world of thousands of orphans. I'm just back from a week of work in Vietnam, where I visited the programs of worldwide orphans in Hanoi, Ba Vi, Vinh Long, Hung Yang, and Saigon. Anywhere in the world where a very poor child lives without a permanent home. Maybe homeless on the banks of the tributary of the Saigon River, without the security of an adult to guide him. Let's all be quiet together for a moment. I know what happens when an audience sits and listens to a speech. We often drift and don't know how it will empower and help us. But let me talk about Win. He's a baby. He's 4 months old. He lies in a crib alone. He's very handsome. And you want him. You meet him. You want to hold him and never let him go. He's sweet. And when you pick him up, he's soft to the touch. And his head smells like fresh flowers. And his formula breath draws you closer. He opens his mouth and is quiet. And his eyes sparkle and grab your eyes. He's now in sync with you. He can do nothing else. He's moving his fingers and toes. He's beginning to smile, but not quite. Then you speak to him in gentle, high-pitched tones. It's inevitable, and he starts to murmur back to you in a cadence that is reciprocal. You bring him closer and rock him, and then you begin to be playful, and you swing and sway and dip him, and his voice is audible now to those around him. He hears his own voice, and he's startled by it. He has gone from an empty baby boy, barely in tune with his physical needs, to a lovable infant. He wants and needs you, and he yearns and longs for you, and you want him desperately. But you need to go, and you put him gently back in the crib, metal bars and a bamboo mat, and leave him in a set point of silence and stillness and emptiness, a stark world of no control and no connection that is sustained and permanent. He's an orphan, and that life of no touch, sound, affection, and attachment is real, and it will kill his intellectual growth, emotional trust, and ability to regulate his vital physiologic self. He will be an unorchestrated being who will not, in the long run, potentially grow or be happy. This lonely, unregulated life leads to criminality, depression, drug abuse, alcoholism, educational failure, and a lack of socialization and connection. Repairing this is expensive. And children are resilient, so they can overcome their losses, but at what cost emotionally and psychologically, and at what cost to society? All 2.2 billion children in the world have a right to grow and be happy. Open your eyes right now with me. The orphans of the world are a resource for human potential. We need them, and we need to have personal responsibility for all of them, one community at a time. I had a destiny as a child to be a doctor and to serve children around the world. I don't want to be alone with my destiny. I'm here today and every day to share my destiny and to ask you to have a new consciousness about the heart and soul of a child. Don't hide from the story. Hold the story close and do just one thing to make the life of an orphan a step closer to wholeness and good health. Work for kids to have permanent homes is the highest priority for sure. Foster care, foster to adopt, kin care, and finally psychosocial programming for extremely impoverished children who may not have access to adoption. Adoption's the gold standard, folks. We can't deny that. Let's not spend another moment arguing about what will work and what doesn't work. Let's just do it. Let's rise up and not allow any more orphaning. Let's help mothers keep their children. Let's create protocols and social service departments that expedite placement of kids in homes. Let's raise awareness and money to serve orphans around the world so that they feel our commitment. Let's not be arrogant and say we have the answer. Let's not go home and forget the destiny. Please join me and us here today, all of us, so we can figure out how to do the right thing. Put it on your agenda, make it a priority, Let me be your guide. Not all of you can be as single-minded as me, but you can be with me, and all of us here can be together from now and forever.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aronson. Let's hear now from Dr. Karyn Purvis.
Thank you. Well, you've heard from my colleagues that we know there are millions of vulnerable children in the world, millions upon millions. We know that each government in each place has done the best they could with what they know. But there's new research that shows us answers. There are new insights that help us understand how to help children reach their full potential. In the United States, only 30 years ago, we did surgeries on infants and newborns without anesthetic because we believed that their central nervous system was immature. So we gave them paralyzing agents and we did surgery. And the death rate, as you could imagine, was intolerably high. We did that not because we intended to harm children, but we did it out of a lack of knowledge. And this is the case with the situation of vulnerable children across the world today. In the U.S., a group of scientists, researchers, medical doctors, pediatricians, the finest names in neuroscience, joined together and looked at the plight of vulnerable children. And they asked the question, what do these children need in order to make the situation they've come from tolerable, in order to be resilient? And the answer they found was that the children were, as they titled their report, hardwired to connect. The fact is, children have to have permanency. They have to have homes. They have to have a sense of belonging. They have to have someone that they can look into the eyes of and know who they are. We know that children coming from hard places now, we understand this, we've not known this until recent years, they have dramatic changes in their brain. If they were starved in utero or exposed to drugs or even high stressors, their brain development is altered already at birth. Their brain chemistry is altered already at birth. These children have different brains if they've experienced abuse, neglect, or trauma. And so they're highly reactive to situations. They're highly responsive. They're overreactive in many ways. These children have different biologies. We know that their bodies are far more sensitive to, for example, fluctuations in blood sugar, because stress, trauma, neglect, hunger, malnutrition have changed the insulin receptor site. So when their blood sugar dips a little down or spikes a little up, we have misbehavior in these children because their bodies and their biologies are fragile. They have different belief systems because those who they expected to protect them were the ones who harmed them. You may know that in the mammalian brain, there are two circuits. And one circuit says, run away from danger. And the other circuit says, run to my caregiver and I'll be safe. But for the child coming from abuse, neglect, or trauma, those circuits that are mutually exclusive were activated at the same time, because the one who brought about the trauma and the terror was the one they wanted to run to. So we have children who have a different brain, a different biology, and a different belief system. Of course, their behaviors are different. And so what we know from science is that there are ways to bring deep healing to a child of any age and of any risk level. I love to say, as I travel across the world speaking to families who foster and who adopt, I've worked with very low-risk children, I've worked with moderate-risk children, and I have worked with children who tried to kill or have killed. I have never yet seen a single child that didn't come to dramatic levels of healing in an informed caregiving environment. But it will not happen in a vacuum. Families have to understand the behavior in view of, so the behavior is the tip of an iceberg. They have to understand that beneath the surface is a different brain, a different body, a different belief system. And if parents are trained and informed, we can bring deep healing and joyful outcomes to even the highest risk children. permanency and connection. We know because the human brain is in ratio the largest brain on the planet. It's the most complex brain, and it's hardwired to develop in the arms of care. The part of the brain for fight, flight, or freeze is busy in the uterus, but the part of the brain that makes us delightfully, joyfully human takes 3 years of tender mentoring. We need permanency for our children. We need policies and procedures that reflect current levels of brain research. When I speak across the world, I often say, for children who are removed from abusive and neglectful environments, they bled before they came to us. They must not bleed on our watch. There's much we can do if we'll embrace what is known and we'll change policies and procedures to care for these vulnerable children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Purvis. Let's move now to our final speaker, our final guest today, to look at some of these issues from a domestic perspective, if you like, the Australian perspective, the Australian Chief Executive of Barnardos, Louise Voigt.
Well, first I'd like to acknowledge we meet on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. This has particular importance, that recognition here now, when we are talking about adoption, because clearly our history has been pretty devastating to many people when we have used adoption in the past. So I want to explain that what we're talking about is totally different from these awful things that happened. We are not suggesting the adoption of Aboriginal children. We are not talking about morally offensive, illegal behaviour, removing children from young, unmarried mothers. We are not talking about children losing touch with their past and not knowing who they are, with a terrible surprise, for instance, when their adoptive parent dies. We at Barnardos have had 20 years in which we have been adopting children. Now, it is perfectly true there are barriers and complexities, but because we as an organisation were so committed to permanency, clearly the end result of permanency, the proper legal position of permanency, is adoption. We found it utterly impossible not to reach this conclusion because it was for children to find security and belonging continually with a family to love and nurture them, not one who sent them home when they were 18, not the state government, but a family, because families are best at rearing children. They can do the deep healing that we've talked about. They can make sure that children feel ordinary, because this feeling of ordinariness is something which our children who've been adopted continue to tell us is critically important to them. We want open adoption, where children still have some limited contact with their past and with their family of origin, so they never question who they are. They never feel totally divorced. You know, all of us come with a past, and particularly the children who are adopted from the out-of-home care system, the foster care system, come with a whole history in their past, even if they are tiny infants. Barnardos has committed itself to finding methods to make adoption possible, such as our child-centred case management system. I mean, when I say child-centred, there is so much of our legislation and our laws here in Australia which is organisationally centred, not child-centred. And starting from the position of the child is what is important. Our case management system considers each individual child and leads towards determination for permanency for that child. Another important method we're using is skilling workers up to provide an environment where natural parents aren't just the opposition, just hostile, but reaching and out to them to help them to understand about what is being done for their children. And even if they can't agree to adoption, which most cannot, making sure that they will agree to ongoing contact because of the child. The adoptive parents we recruit are prepared to facilitate with contact with birth families 2 or 3 times a year on an order from the Supreme Court in New South Wales, because we are selecting people who understand the needs of children and helping children to come to terms with their past. We also recognise that we're in a changing society. People often, when they talk about adoption, talk only about nuclear mother and father. You know, it isn't like that nowadays. Look around you. There are people used to only have, 4 grandparents. For many children now, there are 8 or even more. Society is changing considerably. And we recognise the many diverse groups of different sorts of families in our society, all of whom, if they wish, can give that nurturing that we're talking about. I'd like to put in a plug here for New South Wales. Barnardos works in New South Wales, and so it's a state we know most well. It's been leading the way currently, and in the past too, because it made adoption legislation which enabled us to carry out adoptions rather than itself propagating adoption, but it certainly didn't stand in our way. But now it's going to encourage the state government to provide adoptions for children in the care of the state. It'll be the first state in America, Australia. It's with all these American people here. It's the first state in Australia that's actually at the children's court level going to insist that a decision is made that if a child can't go home, can't go to kin, that is their extended family, then adoption must be considered. I think and hope this is going to change adoption in this country. It's going to mean it's always on the table. Now, we started adoption not from baby adoption. We never were licensed for baby adoption. We started for permanency. At one time, and only a few years ago, the average age of adoption was 9 years of age. I agree with the suggestion that, in fact, in the right circumstance, proper healing can take place. And for those children, they are achieving outcomes which are very similar to that of the normal population. When I say achieving ordinary outcomes, that's really important, because children in the foster care system, by the time they've finished in that system, are years behind in education. They are doomed to, in fact, have a life in which they are well overrepresented in the criminal justice system, mental health services, their physical health is poor. They are the people who have the very early babies and don't do well. And worst of all, when you look at the life history of chronic homelessness, you are seeing the failures of our system in child welfare. So incredibly important that we look at security for the children. The second thing is that what happens is that people think children can wait. Here in Australia, very much when a child comes before the court, it's adults' time that's important. Will, in fact, mum be able to get it together? Will she actually be able to give up the drink and drugs? Will she move from the violent succession of partners? It's adults' time. What is going to happen in New South Wales is there's going to be a push to look at it in terms of time which is going to be important for children. Note, I didn't say children's time, but at least somewhere closer to it. 6 months for restoration for a baby who's under 2, or 1 year for a child who's older and who obviously has ongoing relationship of sort. So this timing is the beginning of the importance in us making decisions. For Barnardos, we've worked for a long time in trying to advocate for adoption, and in New South Wales we're achieving it. But it's not being achieved in other states. Indeed, the state I'm sitting in now, and I know there are in the audience some members of the government here, I'd like to point out that successive approaches to ministers and bureaucrats in the ACT have meant that they have never considered local adoption in a positive way, and particularly not the licensing of organisations which will actively propagate this. However, there are many ways of skinning a cat, and indeed, with ACT, we had a child adopted yesterday in the New South Wales Supreme Court, because, of course, you are so close to New South Wales, and placements made in New South Wales are able to be adopted. But it's important that every state look at this. The Queensland Recent Inquiry, for example, is making all sorts of recommendations, as indeed are the many, many inquiries that have happened in so many states in Australia. And when, in fact, the fuss dies down and the inquiry sort of fades into the background, we still don't get the sort of change in legislation or, most particularly, practice that's going to be important. One of the methods that we are using is actually working with families to understand the sorts of history, because indeed, when a child comes to us, they do come with baggage, to enable people to attend to that deep healing that will be needed. This isn't rocket science. It's something we most naturally have got the capacity to do, and do best when we are encouraged to do it. Barnardos' commitment gets daily strengthened by the way in which the adoption issues are not dealt with elsewhere. So we were delighted when Deb wanted to join us. We hope that this is a campaign whose time is now.
Let me ask the first question, possibly even set of questions. Given the changes that are underway now in New South Wales, but the observations you've made about other states, we've seen so little change over such a long time. Do you sense that there is a sense of latency now? And if I could put the question both to you, Louise, but I might start with Deborah and then come to you. Do you sense that there is actually finally some momentum in relation to this?
I do. I think we're getting traction. I mean, we're talking decades of not optimum adoption practice. So considering it's only 5 years, it takes to move a whole government on this, it takes time, and I feel like we've been talking about this. This morning I spoke at the business checks, and I feel like we've been saying this for so many years, but this morning everyone was like, they're hearing it, and people are realising it's not just about adoptive families wanting to adopt, it's about the larger community saying, taking responsibility, we'll look after the kids. And I think people are really taking that on board now and saying, I play a part in this, and I want to advocate for these children, because you can see what the alternative is for these kids. And how, as a society, can we stand by? I mean, a society is judged by the way we treat our children. So I think we all play a part in this, and we all have a responsibility. And I do think we're going to make shifts.
Louise, just a quick comment.
It is time as now because of all sorts of conditions. For example, very difficult to get foster carers now. There isn't women at home that are waiting to care for children in the way that there were 20 years ago. So that has changed. Society has changed. As I said, social relations are different. Some legislation has occurred allowing a greater number of children to be adopted. The problem is the practice hasn't yet been put in place. As Deb would say, the methods. These are really, really important, which is perhaps our skill in our organisation, but those methods need to be talked about and thought about in each state. How can we do it?
Jane, Karyn, if I could just follow up and ask you from a global perspective in terms of US and obviously internationally, where are we seeing best practice now? What sort of advice? I mean, I know sometimes people from overseas are reluctant to advise what might happen in other countries, but, what sort of advice would you give?
I'm never reluctant to give my opinion.
Good, excellent.
I'm sure you know that. I think for my perspective is I've been doing adoption medicine as a pediatrician for almost 30 years. So I've traveled all around the world, and I've definitely connected with different countries and looked at their practice. And I think that, there are obvious examples of best practice. And I'll just give you one example, and that's Korea. When the Korean conflict was in the 50s, it was clear that, something was going to happen where there would be babies that would be mixes of Americans and Koreans. And a family in Oregon, the Holtz, Harry and Bertha, thought, you know what? It might be a good idea if we asked the American government to take responsibility for Amerasian children who would be otherwise rejected by their families in Korea. And so from that point, in the early 50s, mid-50s, the South Korean adoption program became a very, very vital and important part of managing that issue. And now, years later, hundreds of thousands of Korean youngsters becoming adults in the second generation now were adopted. And that system really is about best practice. It evolved from an orphanage system where children were adopted as older children and then moved into a system that involved foster care and the adoption of infants. There are many examples of this. We can look to best practice all around the world in different countries. But what I want to also add here is that I think at this point in time, we don't really understand exactly how we can change legislation. That's the piece that I think you're going to really need to deal with. I think we all, as practitioners, could probably do all the training that's necessary. Train up the social workers, go into the community and train more social workers, build an infrastructure in countries all over the world. But the piece that you need to concentrate on right now, excuse me for my opinion, is the law, the policy, the advocacy, and changing the way people feel so they're not so afraid to move to the next step.
I think you're meeting the Attorney General after this, so good luck. Karyn, would you like to add anything to that or not?
Sure, I would love to. Thank you. I think that this challenge of how to help serve vulnerable children is a worldwide issue. I know I was in Rwanda with the First Lady not too long ago, and she was saying the problem of the children in Africa, and I said, this is a world problem. We're all learning together. But what I can tell you is that in the United States, we have an inverse corollary in our states. So the states that spend the most money on children and their needs have the lowest per capita prison populations, and the inverse is true. Now, I come, unfortunately, from a state that is third from the bottom on this list and third from the top on this list. And what is becoming true in Texas in only recent years through legislation is that all those serving children who are coming from what we call hard places must be served by caregivers who have been trained in understanding trauma. And I think it's a huge step forward for us as a state. I'm hoping to see changed lives quickly because, unfortunately, science has answers. Some of you may be aware that it's published in the American Medical Association Journal and the American Psychological Association Journal. It takes 17 years on average for what scientists know to get to the field. And our goal is to bring what's known by science to the field in 6 months. There's plenty of ideas about how to help kids heal. And I think the places that are making differences are those that are embracing what's known.
All right, let's move to my colleagues on the floor now. And if I could ask each of my journalist friends to identify who they're addressing the question to. First, we'll start with Glenn Milne.
Glenn Milne, former Vice President of the National Press Club. If I could address my question to the Australian panellists, Deb and Louise. The good doctor mentioned the law, and that's our business down here. And the business of politics, too, is about prioritising. I wanted to know what you think is the first big legislative door that we've got to kick in to make this happen. And a second and related question. It took us 100 years to standardise rail gauges between states in this country. Are we a little more optimistic about adoption laws between states? Thank you.
Well, we're not going to get anywhere unless we've got a champion. I mean, we've got to walk in the door and say, okay, who's going to bring it? Who's going to take it? Who's going to run with this? So that's why we just keep talking, so that they hear it, and I want someone who's impassioned, who gets it, who really gets it, who's going to say, I'm going to take this and I'm going to run with it. And, and it takes unity. Like, we were in Melbourne the other night and we met with a whole lot of stakeholders, CEOs of child advocacy groups, to say, because we haven't got the answers, I haven't got the answers, I'm just talking so that everyone else who knows what they're doing comes to the table. And we sat there with all these people that hadn't been speaking. There hasn't been unity on this issue in Australia. It's so disparate. Adoption seems so disparate here. All the different support groups and leaders, no one's talking to each other. So firstly, I think we're trying to bring everyone together. We had a great meeting the other night. We had, scholars, we had, people who know what they're talking about, putting in suggestions. So that's the beginning. And James Packer's just funded us, I'm thrilled to announce, to actually create policy. So, which, good on him. Good on him.
Louise?
Child welfare is a state responsibility. States have legislation at a state level. States are at different stages in their legislative agendas, but also in where they've reached. Almost all of them have capacity, for instance, to dispense with parental consent, because what we are talking about here is somewhat different than happens overseas with abandoned children. We are talking about people who are often very angry indeed that the state has removed the children and who have gotten little or no understanding about why, that it was for the long-term good of the child, because here in Australia we always have to look at that first. So each state needs to at least reach a stage where the arguments for adoption in their legislation can be those of the more progressive states. And I'd say New South Wales, but also Queensland, because the Commissioner in Queensland a number of years ago was in fact very keen to look at some legislative change for dispensation of consent, which was on grounds which were legitimate and valid and which would sustain, and have done so. I'm less familiar with the legislation in each other state, but bringing about some consistency of legislation in that particular area would certainly help.
And I know Prue Goward is championing this and wants to create a template for other states to follow suit.
The question now for Helen McCabe.
Hello, Helen McCabe from the Australian Women's Weekly. I am loosely, well, a little bit entwined in this and involved with you. And one of the things that have come up this week is a lot of talk about foster children. And I know, Dr. Jane, you've touched on it. But it is quite a powerful area. 18,000 children in Australia are going through the foster system, and I think on average they have 6 placements in homes, which we know what effect that has on children's development. Dr. Jane, you have seen this internationally. You've got experience in the US, particularly New York. I'm really interested in hearing from you about what's happened internationally and whether we can make a difference and what sort of measures we need to do urgently in Australia in order to reduce that particular problem that we have in this country.
Okay. It's a great question. I think that what we probably should do, I mean, I think that this is what countries usually do around the world, is looking at each other's legislation. So I'm going to just, lay out for you that what happened between 1992 and 2000 were a couple of incredibly important laws that were enacted during the Clinton administration. I have to say, President Clinton is a friend of foster care and adoption. And what came of those laws was really one of the most important changes, and that was to change the interval of time that a child was stuck without the ability to become adopted. That was the most monumental and historical change. And I think clearly, by the way, that has occurred in other countries. It occurred right after that and has gone from country to country. You can look up that law. That was the pivotal and important moment that people are going to have to take a stand and trust. Now, that's a difficult moment in your history, to take that trusting moment and see clearly what Louise has just laid out, that 6 months, that's it. You've got 6 months to work in that system. That baby can only be in foster care for 6 months, and then the child has to be available for adoption. That's a tough idea to swallow. Even as I say it, and what we all went through during those years, it was very hard, but everyone wanted to change the system. There was an overwhelming tipping point emotionally. People couldn't tolerate that there were 50,000 children in New York City in foster care. It was an intolerable number. You're looking at intolerable numbers. 18,000 kids in foster care in a country with 23 million people? That's a ridiculous number of children. It's absurd. That is what should drive all of you to a grassroots effort to change the amount of time that children are stuck and not available for adoption. That's my prescription.
Dennis Atkins.
Dennis Atkins from the Courier Mail newspaper. We've heard today about the way that children throughout the world are getting caught up in homelessness and orphanages and so on, and the conflicts that are occurring in the world are adding to this, as we speak. Is there something that any of the panel think a country could do, Australia for instance, in terms of its refugee policies, to give any priority to getting these people through that system? And just a parochial question from a Queensland newspaper for Louise. Are you hopeful that, you mentioned the Carmody inquiry and a lot of the recommendations that were coming out of that, are you hopeful that the Newman government in Queensland will respond positively to those? Thanks.
Who's going to start here?
Okay. I have no reason to be hopeful about that. We made a major submission. We did not hear anything back. I do not know what will occur. Sorry, I have to remain ignorant in that. I mean, they've got the legislation in place. They've got the capacity to do it.
Anyone else?
Anyone else want a comment? No? Okay. Well, happy with that, Dennis? Yep. Yeah, certainly. Okay, we'll go to Tim Gable now. The refugees, sorry.
What's the question around the refugees? A lot. Absolutely. I 100% think there is. I don't know what the policies are, but I think we really need to be proactive about that.
That's the hardest population in any country to address, because that's an issue of xenophobia. And I need not say any more about that here.
So we can do more, but we're not sure just exactly what it is.
If anyone wants to help on that, please contact us.
Tim Gable.
Tim Gable, ABC Radio, and an adoptive parent. Thank you for...
Yay.
Didn't do it alone. Got my wife here. But much of today's talk has been on the domestic issue with the domestic adoption. But Deborah-Lee, what about the 200 people that are left in limbo at the moment with the Ethiopian program put on hold?
I couldn't agree more, and I applaud George Brandis, the new Attorney General, who is actually questioning the closure of the Ethiopian program, and I'm going to visit his office this afternoon. I'm coming, George. And hope that he's going to actually, question it. I would love to see the Ethiopian program open again, because to my knowledge there was no good reason as to the closure of that program. As far as I knew, the Ethiopians were very happy with us and we were happy with them. So, yeah.
Are you hoping not only to, I guess, break the deadlock that exists with those potential adoptive parents, but also reopen the program so that it does become, an avenue for potential adoptive parents in the future?
I mean, Ethiopia, there is a huge amount of kids in Ethiopia, which Jane can address. But so, yeah, and we need to, part of this is we need to develop our relationships with these sending countries. And I always go back to part of the development in those countries too. Part of this ethical adoption piece is to support those mothers in country that don't have options, that don't have choices. So we need to set that up so that there are less children that need a home. So to do adoption, there's so many pieces to it. It's a big holistic picture. So that needs to be part of it as well. So our relationships with these countries needs to be ongoing and proactive, the diplomacy piece.
Jane?
Well, I'm not sure if everyone in the room really understands what happens to a country that closes. And I think we should sort of understand that for a moment, okay? There's good reason for countries closing. And even though I'm an adoption medicine specialist and would love that there'd be boatloads of children coming, back and forth between countries, the problem is that we don't often understand the culture of the country that sends children.
That's the diplomacy, absolutely.
It's a little more than diplomacy in that there are actual differences in the way in which children come into care. The Ethiopian situation involves a tremendous amount of poverty. There's some war and conflict mixed in there. There's disease, HIV prevalence rising high. But the main issue in Ethiopia is that Ethiopians began to see that they weren't so fond themselves of their children leaving. That's an important thing to respect. How would you like it if suddenly Australian children were zipping out the door to American, German, or French households? What does that say about you? We can't take care of our children. Well, it's a world now, it's a global situation where Ethiopians are smart cookies. These are sophisticated people who get educated, and they're on the internet, and they're in the world scene, and they're looking around, and they also see lots of white people coming into town and hanging out in the Hilton or the Sheraton with lovely little black babies. How do you think that feels to them? These are things I had to grapple with as an adoption doctor because I'm a parent through adoption. I've got 2 non-white boys living in my home, one from Vietnam and one from Ethiopia. And although we all, I mean, my God, I would die if I didn't have my children. But it's really important for us. This is the moment where you have to grapple with some very, very difficult and challenging issues that are around how other people feel in other countries. And then what you have to do is you have to help them, which is what Deb was pointing out. You have to invest. We invested millions of dollars in America in credentialing adoption agencies and didn't give a effing dollar to any country to help them create a social infrastructure that would allow women to make decisions about their own lives. We never counseled a woman. We never let her sit somewhere with a social worker and ask her how desperate and angry she felt. We never helped her get an education or a job. We just tried to put money into transparency for adoption so it all looked good and it moved through the immigration departments well. That's not what I want for America, nor is this something I want for Australia. I don't want something that politically looks good. I want us to go deeper and do what's morally right. And there are people in this room, and Deb did it this morning beautifully. What did you do?
I don't know. What did I do?
You did. You asked a question. How many people in this room?
Oh, yeah. How many people in this room are touched by adoption? Either your mother, your brother, you know, have a friend who's adopted. How many people are touched by adoption here who know someone? Yeah. Hello? I mean, this is when I first started speaking out about this. This is what shocked me. There's no census on adoption. And it amazed me every time I talk about it. I say, oh, my brother, oh, my aunt, I know my next door neighbour. It's a huge amount of people. And we haven't talked about it for years. We don't talk about it, you know, because of the past practice of secrecy and shame surrounding it. So that's what we did the first year out was let's talk about adoption. And then we're still talking about adoption. So hopefully with all this talk, we can actually get some action that we can do it really good.
Question now from John O'Neill.
Yeah, thank you. Former journalist. Nice to be back with colleagues. And I'm an adoptee and I'm an adopting parent. And I'm also chair of Adoption Awareness Australia. So my question is to Karyn Purvis. Dr. Purvis, in 2005, the now Madam Speaker Bishop found that there was an adoption crisis in Australia as only 500 kids were adopted the previous year. Well, last year, there were only 330 adoptions in Australia, yet the waiting lists are literally years long. And my question to you is, what's happening to those kids as the months and the years go by?
Thank you. Well, the tragedy is those children are languishing in care. Children are traumatized by systemic care. They're healed by family care. And the more placement changes our children have, the less likely they'll be able to make stable relationships as adults. And the less permanency and connection that our children have, the less they will heal and the more traumatized they will become. And if it were not for the love of children and for the trauma they're enduring that we did something, certainly a business person would want to do something for the society because those children have no place to go but to hard places and do hard things. And it is on us. That blood is on us.
Ken Rattle.
Look, all of you up there come from federations, and federations have particular problems. You've talked about the need for a uniform approach. This happened in Australia with marriage law, and now there's a very strong movement to move away from the single model that was introduced then. Do you think you have to promote a specific codified solution to the problems you're looking at before you'll make any political progress?
I think specific is good. I think the more specific we are, the clearer our objectives and our intentions they'll be met. And you're referring to the whole, it needs to be harmonised and streamlined and simplified. Did that answer your question?
But I think that, Louise made an interesting point, which I thought I'm going to be thinking a lot about, and that's the issue of the states. Sometimes what happens is, right, if the states are the role models and put into practice, right, then what happens is it then flows from state to state.
But also, our federal government often takes leadership in this. It'll inquire into a problem of some sort, which may have state responsibility aspects to it. And its encouragement is often an encouragement which would lead the states to make some similar sorts of laws within each of their jurisdictions. And that surely is what you're asking for adoption here in Australia. I feel competent only to discuss that, because here in Australia, child welfare law is certainly not going to be taken over by the federal government. I mean, one cannot see them stepping into that murky water of child welfare legislation and child protection. I would think that they will run a mile from it. But what they can do, and what should be done, is that they convene meetings to talk about the general needs in the Australian population. We've currently got, for instance, a children's commissioner. That would be one of the ways in which it could happen. But there are many ways in which the federal government has made inquiries and looked broadly at aspects which then become state responsibility.
Peter Phillips.